Okay, so we will begin. Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Brianna Muir and I'm the marketing manager of the Rotman Business List at University of Toronto Press. I would like to welcome you to the launch of the Behaviorally Informed Organization, edited by Dilip Soman and Catherine Young. It's right here. And before we begin our launch, we would like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto Press operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron, Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people, and we feel truly grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So before I turn it over to our panelists, I would like to introduce everyone to Dilip Soman. So Dilip is the Canadian Research Chair in Behavioral Science and Economics and serves as the Director of the Behavioral Economics in Action Research Center at Rotman, the Bear Institute. So his research is in the area of BI and its applications to consumer well-being, marketing, and policy. He's also the author of The Last Mile, which is also published by the University of Toronto Press. So welcome, Dilip, and I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so very much, Brianna, and thanks everyone for being here. Good morning to everyone in North America, good afternoon in Europe, and good evening to those of you in Asia and India. Excited to be here. This book has been a little while in the works, and what we're going to do today is I'm going to start us off by just walking everyone through the book, giving the lay of the land, telling you a little bit about the genesis, and I'll take about 10 minutes to do that, and then I'll invite my fellow participants, Kelly Peters, Catherine Young, and Varun Gowri at that point in time to join me in a panel discussion about the book. So let me begin by giving you some very brief ideas on where the book has come from, what the genesis is, and why we put this together. So this is the book, Behaviorally Informed Organizations. Catherine Young and I have co-edited the book. We have a lot of contributors. Included in those are, of course, Kelly Peters and Varun Gowri, who you will both hear from a little later. Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes taking stock of applied behavioral science. What have we achieved? What's next for the field? And then tell you a bit about an institute that we've put together, a partnership that we've put together here at the University of Toronto, but it's a worldwide partnership. It's called BI.org. We'll just walk through the book, introduce some key ideas, and then like I say, I will invite my fellow contributors for a short discussion. So looking back at the past 12 or 13 years, gosh, it's been 13 years since Nudge was published. I think it's fair to say that behavioral science has had an impact in the world of policy, welfare, and business. And on this slide, I've just listed some success stories. There's a lot of other success stories. Many of these have been written about in the book that Brianna just spoke about, The Last Mile, and have been fundamental in changing the way in which governments and businesses think about the use of behavioral science. So simple stuff, changing defaults. We've had 401k auto-enrollment successes. We've managed to get people to get annual health checkups by making it the default, prompted choice and organ donations, a lot of interesting work done here in Ontario, flu shots. One of our network researchers, Katie Milkman, has been leading a number of initiatives in this area to try and make sure that we know as much as we do about how we can get people to get their annual flu shots. We've also had success with simpler interventions, things like framing things as gains versus losses. So a colleague of mine, Tanjim Hussain, has had success in changing the way in which productivity bonuses were presented to workers, either presented as a potential loss or a potential gain, and shown that there were significant differences in terms of the impact of those bonuses on productivity. And likewise, in other domains, we've managed to get people to purchase more energy efficient appliances by highlighting what they would lose if they didn't purchase those, as opposed to highlighting what they would gain. We've simplified communication. We've engaged people better with more effective communications. We've done improved savings rates through interventions such as earmarking and reminders. And of course, the poster child for a lot of the behavioral science work, the Save More Tomorrow program by Richard Thaler and Shlomo Banazi. And I could go on and on listing all of these successes, but I think the field is at an interesting point where we now need to think about what's next. So we put together this partnership at the University of Toronto. Well, I guess it's based at the University of Toronto, but it is a worldwide partnership with about 20 academic researchers from all across the globe, as well as 18 partner organizations. And in that partnership, we sort of thought about three ways in which phase two of our behavioral science journey is likely going to look very different from phase one. In particular, we're going to focus on three specific sets of challenges. One is, how do we prepare organizations to effectively use behavioral science, right? So the thing that struck all of us is that universities are designed to be scientific. They are designed to collect evidence, to use evidence, and we have mechanisms in place for us to deploy all of the tools of science. Organizations aren't necessarily built for doing science. And so what do we need to do to prepare the organization to effectively use the science of behavioral science? Second, a lot of the successes that we saw in the first decade or 12 years of behavioral science were in what we're going to call nudge solutions. And of course, we can spend a lot of time debating what a nudge is and what it isn't. But the way we think about it, a nudge is a tweak. It's a simple solution. It's a slight change in the context. And in fact, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein talk about the fact that nudges are low cost, where the returns on those sorts of investments are high. We've had a lot of nudge successes. We've changed forms. We've changed the way questions have been framed. We have changed websites. We have changed the text of text message reminders. But I think it's time to now look beyond those nudge solutions. And in the last mile, I talked about a lot of these nudge type solutions as being effective at the last mile. Can we now move behavioral science up into the first mile, or in general, up the value stream? Can we have products that are designed on the basis of behavioral science? Can we think about other things we could do within organizations, auditing the decision environment, improving managerial decision making, all of those things that we need to think about in terms of moving behavioral science up the value channel. And the third big thing that we are focused on, and in fact is a subject of a second book that we are working on, is translation and scaling. How can we make it easy? How can we create practical guidelines for people in the field, in the wild, to take some of the findings that have been generated in a lab, in a control setting, and not only translate them into successful pilots or successful implementations, but scale them. And we talk about scaling both horizontally as well as vertically, horizontally across domains, vertically to the full population within a given domain. So those are the three things that we are really interested in tackling as a group over the next 5 years. And of course, there's a bunch of other things that we won't get into at this point in time. So I think the partnership has a very simple narrative, which is we have a compelling case for why organizations should use behavioral science, but we don't have a very good science of using that behavioral science. So like I said, we don't know how to help organizations translate knowledge. We don't have a science of that. We don't have a science of what organizations should do in terms of building their own resources in order to be able to use the science and what they need to do to scale. So that's what this partnership is all about. And that was the genesis of this book. So The book has 16 chapters. They basically come from 4 different sort of voices. There's a bunch of voices that talk about the behaviorally informed organization as an agenda. What do we mean by the science of using behavioral science, or how should we embed behavioral science within organizations? Or interesting question that Kelly Peters raises in her chapter. Why do organizations that need to be behaviorally informed don't? Why do they resist it? Right. So we'll hear a bit more from her on that as well. In part 2, we talk about 4 different overarching insights, 4 different tools. The notion of sludge. Think about sludge as the evil cousin of nudge. Nudging makes things easy for people. Sludging makes things a bit more complex. We write about guidelines. How do we write better guidelines? How do we simplify the way we communicate? We have a chapter on the boundedly rational consumer continuum. I mean, we've always talked since Nudge about people either being humans or econs. We talk about system 1, system 2. We generally have a dichotomy of the way we think about people. But this chapter offers a slightly more nuanced segmentation strategy. How do we think about the fact that there might be shades of gray between humans and econs? And then there's a chapter on attention and what that actually means in terms of how practitioners can use those ideas. In the third part of the book, lots of examples of initiatives using behavioral science, both from business and from policy. So we have work on habits and financial services and programs and policies within the Canadian government, tax filing, online privacy, and of course, the use of behavioral science in international development efforts. And we'll hear a bit more about that as well later. And then 2 chapters at the end talking about how do we make it work within organizations. What's a good set of prescriptions for building partnerships? What's a good set of prescriptions for thinking through translation, for thinking about how do we use the science of behavioral science more effectively? So that's a quick snapshot of the book. Many of you have already seen it, and I hope all of you get a chance to read it, and we would love to hear your comments. So I'm going to call it a day in terms of my introductory remarks, and I'm going to invite at this point in time my lovely co-panelists, Catherine Young, Kelly Peters, and Varun Gavri to switch on their cameras and join me in a discussion. I'm going to very briefly introduce the 3 of them because honestly, they all need no introduction. Catherine is on the faculty at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She's previously served on the faculty of the National University of Singapore. And while she was at Singapore, has done a lot of work with various government agencies in Singapore. And so I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about her efforts there. And I have to say on a personal note, I've known Catherine since, gosh, 2009, maybe 1999. When I was on the faculty at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and Catherine was finishing up her PhD at that point in time. So fantastic to have you on board, Catherine. Kelly Peters is the CEO and co-founder of BE Works, one of the foremost behavioral science consulting firms, if that's a good way of describing BE Works. It is perhaps the closest thing we know to an academic institution outside of academia. And as Kelly will tell you, one of the things that's really interesting about BE Works is the fact that they hire primarily folks who are scientists as opposed to consultants. The method is science, and I know Kelly's had a long and distinguished career also in financial services before, and I remember meeting you, Kelly, again. It's got to be like 10, 15 years ago. But BE Works was founded by Kelly with Dan Ariely, who everybody knows, and Nina Majar, who also everybody knows, former colleague of a lot of us here, actually. Varun Gavri, when he was a member of the Embed team at the World Bank, the Behavioral Insights Unit, that's when I think Varun and Nina overlapped. And Varun has subsequently moved on. He's now a fellow at the Brookings Institute. Varun, again, has a long and distinguished career especially in the development field. And he was one of the key people responsible for the creation of Embed within the World Bank. And both Kelly and Varun are amazing success stories of how behavioral science can be embedded within practice in different ways. Varun did this in the context of a large multinational organization and creating a unit within. Kelly, yours was more of a independent an independent organization that kind of changed the way in which consulting was done in this space. So excited to have everyone on board. I'm just going to open up with a bunch of questions. I suspect there will be lots of questions coming in from our audience as well. Just a reminder, if you could please submit your questions via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. We will get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. So if I may begin with you, Catherine. I spoke a bit about sort of, the partnership and its goals, but walk us through your perspective. I mean, what got you so excited? I remember first reaching out to you saying, should we do this book and would you help co-edit it? And I've never received a yes as quickly as I did on that occasion. So just walk us through sort of your worldview of the behaviorally informed organization, Catherine.
Right. So thank you, Dilip. So when I work with organizations and companies in Singapore and now in Hong Kong, I think these organizations are all very open-minded in trying to incorporate BI into their operations. And they are all very enthusiastic about BI, but at the same time, they struggle in bringing BI knowledge from research to practice, right? So some of them might have difficulties identifying the right nudge. Some of them are confused at the implementation stage. I think our partners have gone through all these, and there are really a lot to share with the BI community. So I think this book project will just give us exactly the kind of platform we need to gather insights and pragmatic recommendations from our partners and share with them with the organizations. So that's why I am very interested in it.
And I think the one point you implicitly made, which I found interesting about all of our work in this partnership, is that it's a co-creational partnership. It's not one of those academic practitioner interfaces where academics produce knowledge, practitioners consume them. I think that's the traditional model we have of knowledge translation. I hope Varun and Kelly agree with that, but I think at least that's been my experience. But Kelly, turning to you then, and just your thoughts on maybe sort of your experience with BE Works in terms of the challenges you've seen, and like I said, that title of your chapter is fascinating. Why do companies that should use behavioral science, why do they not do it? Why do they resist it, Kelly?
Yeah, so the title of the chapter is, this idea of, gut check. And I really wanted to get at the barrier that we face, which is there's just so much reliance in intuition. And, all of us are guilty of that. Of course, our intuition is an incredibly powerful force for making observations in the world and potentially formulating hypotheses. But often organizationally, it sort of stops and starts there. And this is the approach that we took in the chapter. My co-author, Dr. O'Malley, and I wanted to just actually use a behavioral lens. First of all, let's identify what some of the biases are that go into organizations' resistance to BE. And some of them are classic. So it's easy for us to talk about, for instance, status quo bias. But another one is this issue of ambiguity. And it's probably one of the most challenging things that we face. And that's where, someone who's interested in BE, they've read some of the books, they've heard about it, they're excited about the promise, but kind of making that final leap requires them to overcome ambiguity and aversion. And so one of the things that I know when they're starting to suffer from that is they turn up the heat on, do you have a case study for our industry? Oh yeah, we kind of, do you have one for this problem? Do you have one for this problem with a company just like ours who's done exactly this same thing? And then I can understand how behavioral economics, how insights and the method all come to life. So we wanted to understand, first of all, what those different barriers are in an organization adopting BE. And that's a classic one.
That's interesting. And Kelly, also, if you could just kind of walk us through the BE Works journey. I mean, it's a fascinating story. I remember when we first spoke about it and you had a vision of kind of putting together a team of just scientists. A lot of people were skeptical, but it's worked.
It's worked. It's been yeah, it has been many years since Dilip and I met. I was at RBC, and the wonderful thing about RBC is it's a culture that's very much has innovation within its DNA. And when Dan and Nina and I came together with two other partners that were from the fintech sector who were very passionate about innovation, the idea was that we can very much have a holistic and comprehensive methodology to produce insights within the business world. The laboratory doesn't need to stop at the academy. It can transfer not only into the real world, but the real world can also become its own laboratory and transfer our insights back into academia. So it's all about building this two-way bridge. That was the fundamental idea. And when we thought about how do we hire for this, for BE Works, it's the same thing we recommend to the companies and other organizations that we work with, which is to hire scientists, to hire practitioners, not to make the one aspect is hiring champions who are super passionate about the field. They've read the mainstream books, they see the opportunity, they're very up to date on the different kinds of research that have been done. But we actually need to have someone who's has the skills and the ability to actually do the science. That's people who live and can debate all day about the difference between SPSS and R, which journals are the best ones for us to publish our research in. That's practicing scientists. And so our idea was, how do we hire actual scientists and to collaborate with the champions who get it? That was that initial vision for BE Works, and that's the journey we've been on.
So interesting, and I think there were two things that you mentioned that sort of got me thinking about, Varun, your early years with behavioral science. One, the notion of ambiguity aversion. And when you were at the World Bank, I mean, that's a massive entity. I suspect that probably played a role, and there was perhaps not just at the World Bank, but elsewhere, you've seen stories of where the organization tends to resist anything that's new. But I think the other interesting one was the world being your lab. And I think when you have a massive organization like the World Bank, like the WHO, like some of these large entities, the potential for actually learning from the field is tremendous. And so that seems like a shame to let opportunities like that go by. Just your thoughts, Varun, on sort of thinking about embedding behavioral science in the context of something like international development or policy or welfare versus organizations that are more profit focused. Any quick thoughts there on your experiences and how that worked out?
Yeah, Dilip, I would say that international organizations like the World Bank, UNDP, WHO have all moved in the direction of using behavioral insights. You see it in government organizations as well. There's been fairly quick take up, in my view, for a number of reasons. The first is that organizations like this really operate under, in the public sector, under a budget constraint. And so that language from Sunstein and Thaler about big impact for relatively low cost, that was very attractive. People thought, wow, this is a way to leverage our current resources and have a bigger impact on welfare in the way that we want to, without necessarily, going out and making the case, which is hard, for bringing more resources into the public sector. I also think that in the public sector organizations, in governments around the world and international development, but also in OECD countries, there was no real rival group. In businesses, you often have a marketing department, and they sort of like do the behavioral science, and they have access to large volumes of data of customer transactions, sales. Public sector doesn't necessarily have that data. And so I think the public sector almost needed the scientific principles to address some of those issues that the private sector was doing in a more empirical, data-driven way, and begin to reach consumers, citizens. Some of the important work early on for the public sector and for the World Bank was really in taxation. We really wanted to find a way to increase tax payments, bring them earlier in the process and increase them altogether. And nudges, reminders, social comparisons made a big difference. So I think that's the particular example of how public sector was attracted to an approach like this.
That's great. There's an interesting question that's come through the Q&A on this whole notion of there being a compelling case for why organizations should use behavioral science. So I think I made that claim. Adrian asks, could you support that claim a little bit? And Kelly, I know you've written a fair bit in your chapter about sort of why organizations should be behaviorally informed. Maybe I'll toss it to you if you have any opening thoughts. I'm happy to add stuff in. I'll probably come back to you, Varun, as well. Why do we have a compelling case for organizations to use behavioral science?
Okay, well, you outlined some of the just bottom line impact and to be able to have a measurable line of sight on that impact. So for me, I think one of my favorite reasons, and this is something that we could probably all talk about for the whole day. One of my favorite reasons is the democratization of innovation. So not only do we have a method by which, like companies talk all the time about, we need to have an innovative culture. How do we do that? So we need a method by which to do that. Let's have a language. And the scientific method actually brings us on the journey of having a method by which to do innovation. But now within that, this democratization of innovation means it doesn't matter who comes up with an idea. We start to depoliticize that, and we can actually run experiments to see what works. You don't have to be someone who's maybe the most senior person in the room or the most tenured individual or the most popular individual. Each of those ideas can be subjected to scrutiny, and the scientific method allows us to see what works. But then the flip side, and remember, when we talk about innovation, we also need to talk about failure. It's very common, right, to talk about failure. Well, the scientific method lets us destigmatize failure. Why? Because we can not only learn what works, but gives us an opportunity to frame and understand and dig deep in terms of understanding what didn't work. So being able to have a process and a method for innovation, something that destigmatizes and democratizes and allows people from across the organization to bring ideas to the table, and then provides a valuable framework for failure. Those are some of the reasons why BE is incredible.
So I'm also going to go to Catherine and Varun in just a minute to see if they have any perspectives. But I thought it would be helpful for us to recap what we mean by a behaviorally informed organization. So I kind of, after all of the chapters were in, I kind of read through and I came up with a laundry list. So I'm just going to read off my laundry list. We could have some disagreements maybe at the end. But a behaviorally informed organization basically understands that all of its stakeholders, be they customers, be they employees, are human and not econs. And so therefore it designs for humans everything, including internal processes like HR processes or payroll processes or whatever else. And then obviously outside facing processes are also designed for humans. That means we assume that our stakeholders might not be as interested in whatever it is we want them to do as we think they should be. It assumes that they'll forget to do stuff and all of that stuff. The other thing that you mentioned, Kelly, again, behaviorally informed organization is evidence driven. It knows that just data isn't the same as evidence, that there's got to be a scientific way of trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. It believes in the test, learn, adapt philosophy. And of course, it tries to be as human compliant by reducing sludge and facilitating decisions for people. So I think that's a simple kind of checklist. But having put that out there, maybe Catherine, do you have anything in terms of, again, building that case for why organizations of all shapes and sizes and forms should be behaviorally informed?
Well, I think because a lot of the time it really helps us to get things done when we adopt a human-centric perspective when we in managing humans, right? Then it reminds me of one of the chapters in the book, a very simple and interesting example. I think it comes from chapter 9 by Kyle Murray and Shelley Chen. They talk about how do you get people to return cutleries from the when people eat at the canteen, they take away and then eat at the office, they don't return the cutleries back, right? So how do you get the people to return the cutleries? All right, so like they would put up signs and ask people to remember to return the cutleries, and it doesn't work, right? So when they take the human-centric perspective, try to make it simple, make it easy for people to return the cutleries, then it just works. Right? So sometimes this is not whether we should or we should not do it, but what works better when we are interacting with human beings. So basically to adopt a human-centric perspective.
Yeah, and I keep saying companies spend so much time and energy and effort and money trying to be compliant with the law. And they have a compliance department. I wish they had a human compliance department for everything they did. I know, Varun, let me toss that to you.
Yeah, so one of the things I think of here, Dilip, is that I think it's a line from Eldar Shafir, in one of his papers or books. He says something like, the question is not whether you use behavioral science, but whether you use it well or badly. You always make assumptions about human behavior, and those assumptions can be accurate or inaccurate, effective or ineffective. So for example, one of the big wins in behavioral science and behavioral policy relates to retirement savings. And for many years, companies were offering matching for individuals, employees who would contribute to their retirement savings plan. It sort of worked, but the research found that what was far more effective was to default people into retirement savings. In fact, 99 cents on the dollar, according to one study, was wasted in the sense that it went to people who would have saved anyway. Mm-hmm. So those companies were using behavioral science. Their model was that people respond to this incentive of a match. But more accurate behavioral science found that inertia was a larger barrier. So it's not a question of whether to use it, but whether you use it well or badly.
And I guess kind of the other big overarching worry or friction in line with what Kelly said earlier about ambiguity aversion is just, this stuff calls for a lot of humility, right? I mean, what if I did an experiment and found out that everything I'd been doing for the past 20 years was not the most effective solution? And so I think just building that culture where we say, okay, look, the optimal solution might change with time because our science is very context dependent, I think would be super helpful. A bunch of questions coming in that I think all have the same theme. So I'm going to kind of club a few together. There's one in particular by Aman that I'm just going to read out because I think that may capture the essence of what all of these people are asking. How does the book in particular and the science more generally differentiate between being behaviorally informed in the direction of manipulating behavior versus optimizing behavior for the collective well-being or the well-being of society, right? And maybe I'll start with you, Kelly. I mean, we've had all of these discussions on what is manipulation versus what is nudging and when is it ethically the right thing to do. So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so thankful so far. We haven't been tasked with doing anything that would be considered unethical. It has been about maximizing that that stakeholder value, as you talked about earlier, Dilip. I do think that behavioral economics gives us so much potential for helping organizations be much broader in their scope and in their intention, that it's not just about financial performance. Financial performance is something that's been so easy for companies to focus on, the bottom line, because you have the data, you have the GAAP standards for reporting, you have comparability across organizations, you're able to buy, sell, trade, invest in companies as a function of financial data. Now companies have the opportunity to leverage behavioral economics and being able to create and commit to sustainability goals that look at the behavior and commitments to all of the stakeholders that are affected by the organization, employees, communities, the environment, and so on. So by this, now I'm actually just significantly increasing the scope and the opportunity for maybe not only what organizations should be accountable for and how they're held to account, but potentially that introduces more risk, not less risk. If as a company I say, oh, look at all of my commitment to sustainability, reward me, come work for me, buy from me. So potentially there's more opportunity for ethical manipulation and exploitation. So what do we have as an answer to that? Well, we have something that's, first of all, embedded within behavioral science itself, which is transparency, data, the ability to see and observe what's actually happening and how the organization is performing on each of these measures. So that's a more a broad and aspirational answer. And then I think a second dimension is just look at the work that Dilip and Cass Sunstein and lots of other folks are doing around sludge, and of course Dr. Thaler. So sludge itself, the concept of are you making it difficult to unsubscribe to something? Are you making it difficult to get into a less expensive plan or a better plan? Organizations should commit to doing things like creating a sludge index for themselves to make sure that they're not exploiting things like defaults or framing effects to misguide consumers, instead of making behavioral economics something human-centric to help them optimize their well-being and enjoyment out of your products and services.
But what I'm curious, in terms of the development world, like, did you actually get any ethical pushback on sort of using behavioral science, let's say in a developing country, or to work on welfare initiatives? I mean, you mentioned Eldar, and I think I keep getting reminded of a conversation I had with him about the notion of ethics being relative. I mean, if the world is conspiring to take advantage of people, what are the ethics of not doing anything to fix it? So I'm just curious to hear what your experience was there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think big picture, we did not get that much pushback. The reason being, I think for us, was that we worked in partnership with governments. The World Bank works always at the behest and partnership with the government in question. And with the government support, we were able to go ahead and do projects that, for the most part, had something to do with reducing poverty or increasing economic opportunity. And the latter two aren't particularly controversial, in writ large. There were some things that may have been controversial in some contexts. For instance, in some countries, increasing the share of women in the labor market is not universally supported. But because we are working with government, when we ventured into some of these topics, we could say, well, look, this is something that the government's doing and we're really working with them. And effectively, the government was doing it. We were just sort of backing them up. If I could just say, on manipulation more generally, I think that really there are many things in the public sector that governments do that are already manipulative, taxation, conscription into the army. Nudging is pretty small, right, in the grand scheme of things when it comes to manipulation. The key is whether it's like revealed and publicized or not, because people want to know that something's happening. So our principle was always, the interventions have to be public, they have to be debated, just like anything else. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, there's research showing that when people are told they're being nudged, the nudge still works. So there's no downside to actually disclosing what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think a lot of the examples you gave about sort of the world already manipulating people, taxation or whatever else, right? These are one-size-fit-all type of mandate-like things. Thou shalt pay taxes, right? And it always reminds me of the difference between equity and equality, where in fact, you could be equal to everyone. In terms of what you're doing, but that same equality might either benefit or hurt people differently as a function of their circumstance. And so that's where I think there is the potential to use behavioral science to better understand where that heterogeneity is. There's also a question that actually came in from Linda Ridley that sort of you already started getting at, Varun, this whole notion of, can behavioral science help with sort of things like racism or gender equality or other forms of discrimination? So you did talk about gender equality briefly, but just curious if there's your thoughts on whether behavioral science could help with some of these other things. Like we're seeing a lot of these racism-related challenges now in the world, exclusion based on income, ethnicity. So just any top-line thoughts you had on that, Varun?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a super important and interesting topic, of course. I mean, I think on gender, we had projects that tried to measure and motivate people in our case in Jordan, for more women to enter the labor market. Jordan has in that region of the world, the percentage of women who have completed schooling college schooling is very high for women, but has one of the lowest rates of labor market participation for women in the world. It's partly about social norms. And the thought is, people might think, men might be thinking, all the other men don't want my spouse to work, and so therefore I don't want my spouse to work. But that could be mistaken. And there's some interesting research out of Saudi Arabia that shows exactly that, that to be the case. On race, obviously it's a huge issue in the world. It's always been, but it's sort of more salient now. There's some recent work, a good review by Betsy Pallack and Don Green, looking at race-related interventions and at the organizational level, behavioral type interventions, and finds that we don't really know very much yet about what's effective. So obviously it's something we want to keep working on, and people have been, but I think we're still at the learning stage.
That's right. Catherine, if I can come back to you, I think, we've discussed a lot of specific problems, and we've also talked in the book a lot about translation-related challenges, or why it's difficult for academics and practitioners to be on the same wavelength almost, right? And you've got a fantastic passage in the book, which is entitled "The Problem with Problems." And I know you've written about sort of the context of an education intervention. So what is the problem with problems, Catherine?
By problem with problems, I mean, we often have problem with problem definition. So the idea of problem definition is that we must know the problem and underline its issue, they understand its underlying issues to be able to find a solution, right? So it's a very simple idea. And we know that problem definition is very important for solving complex behavioral problems, but there are barriers that stop us from doing it properly. And one of the barriers, I think, is quite common in organizations, which is solution-mindedness. So basically, when we are under the pressure to solve problems quick, to get things done quick, right? We may be tempted to adopt some what we call off-the-shelf solutions from behavioral science literature without really digging deep to find out the true character of a problem, right? Let me give you an example, right? So we have seen a lot of a very common use of reminders, right? I would say we have seen medical appointments reminders, tax payment reminders, and in medical care, there are even some automated system that sends SMS messages that remind patients to take their pills, their medications. So reminder is wonderful nudge because it is easy to implement, it's economical, and I'm sure that it is one of those popular off-the-shelf nudges. But if we take a closer look of, let's say, the medication non-adherence problem, we notice that patients, they sometimes skip doses for different reasons, right? Some of them would simply really forget to take medicines. And for these patients, reminders help. But some patients might have the wrong belief that it is okay to skip a dose when they don't feel sick. Or some patients might just want to save money, or some of them just hate the side effect, right? So reminders can't really get these people to take their medications, right? So if we step back a little bit, we know that if we actually go ahead and analyze a problem like this, we will come to realize that one nudge doesn't fit all. And sometimes the best nudge might not be the most suitable one. The best nudge might not be the most popular one on the shelf. And sometimes we might need to use a combination or what we call a cocktail of nudges to solve a grand policy problem, right? But all these solutions won't come by unless we actually sufficiently rigorously define a problem. So that's what we mean by problem with problems.
So that's super interesting. I think it opens up a lot of other questions. And I'm actually going to take this opportunity to tell everyone about the next book we're working on, because it actually builds on this particular idea. The book is called Behavioral Science in the Wild. It is co-edited by me and Nina Majar, who we spoke about. And it essentially attempts to ask the following question. If you're a practitioner and you've read a published piece of work, be it a field trial, be it a experiment, and you say, aha, that's interesting, I have a similar problem. How do I go about translating what was in that paper to what you're going to do in the field and implement it? That's the big question. Again, the book comes in 4 different parts. We've got a lay of the land, which essentially builds on what Catherine just spoke about and develops a framework for thinking about translation there. A bunch of chapters that look at what Catherine called the popular off-the-shelf solutions. So peer effects or reminders or whatever else. Like, I mean, these are things that have worked really well. We've seen a lot of success stories. But people that have done that research have written chapters on, hang on, it doesn't always work. Here's what you want to think about in terms of when it works and when it doesn't. A number of chapters that look at specific context areas, domain areas. So how do I use them in healthcare? How do I use them for tax compliance and so on and so forth? And then finally, a series of tools that talk about, very, very practical challenges. So how is digital nudging different from nudging in the physical world? How do I think about adapting a solution for a domain in which there has been no prior research? So for example, we just spoke about racism. There's not a whole lot of nudging interventions there. So if I'm trying to develop an intervention for that, how do I do that? Something called a transparency checklist. If you are an author, what are the kinds of things you should be revealing in your paper so that other people can better use that research and so on and so forth. So that's a book that's currently being finalized, and hopefully a few months from now, we'll be here talking about that one. But there is an interesting question that has come through Gregory Smith, and it's a question that I think is for everyone, because I'd be curious to hear everyone's perspectives. Greg is interested in hearing whether the pandemic has heightened interest in behavioral science, or conversely, has it created newer challenges? And of course, we've had behavioral science being in the policy spotlight thanks to some early adventures and misadventures and people saying things that they didn't have evidence for and so on and so forth. But keeping that aside, curious to hear, Kelly, are you hearing more of an interest, less of an interest, things that we should be worried about? And I'll get back to you as well, Varun.
There's been some changes to some of our projects that have let us actually dig deeper on the diagnostic side of our project journey. Often, I was writing so many notes about what Catherine was saying, this idea of there being this hunger for solution or solution-mindedness. I think that everyone needs to take that away, because I think that many organizations are absolutely guilty of that. There's this desire to hurry up and have an impact. And we've actually needed to use the pandemic as a time to sort of slow down and dig deeper on the why of human behavior before we get on with the solutions. We've needed to do research that just let us understand, has this behavior changed as a function of the pandemic before we go on with the journey of changing it even further. So think about things like in the energy domain. So we've had very big changes to how people are using energy at home versus in offices. And we've done extensive work on time of use pricing. How can organizations continue with driving shifts in energy consumption in a time of the pandemic when our behavior has so radically changed? So it's given us an opportunity and the need to pause some of our behavior change projects to actually dig deeper to understand how people are consuming or using those products and services in the first place. So that's been one of the benefits.
Varun, any quick thoughts on what has the pandemic done for us? Good, bad?
Yeah. So I think early on, it would have been good to have a behavioral playbook for mask use and social distancing.
Yeah.
We as a community might have done that, and I think we could think ahead to future challenges where having a playbook in advance might be useful. Secondly, I think it's within the behavioral world, it's highlighted even more the importance of countering misinformation. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of misinformation about vaccine use and the causes of COVID and all these things. And online, how to sort of counter that, how to quote unquote inoculate people against misinformation has become an important topic to address. And then finally, what's coming up now is vaccine hesitancy. How do we think a little bit about that, and how do we overcome that? And I think that highlights, something that you mentioned, Dilip, which is heterogeneity and or market segmentation. I think we're going to need to think a little bit about what are the types of vaccine hesitancy. Some of it is political, some of it is this sort of crunchy granola resistance, to putting things in your body. Some of it is marginalized communities, and we need to target our messages to different people. So I think misinformation and market segmentation are the parts of behavioral science that have been emphasized through in the course of the pandemic.
That's great, thank you. Varun, if I can stay with you, there's another question. It's a long question, but I'm going to try and crystallize it down to the nuts and bolts, which is from Shobik. And Shobik Dasgupta asks, when we spoke about embedding behavioral science within organizations, you probably had to make a pitch to someone in the top leadership saying, we need this. What were the objections that you got, if any, to that? Were there any caveats, like when you went up and said, we need a behavioral unit, for example, within this large international organization? What was the sort of pushback that you heard? And probably Kelly has a perspective on that too.
Yeah, so I mean, in our case, we had support from my chief economist and from the president of the World Bank. They were very much behind the initiative. Some of the resistance came from the neoclassically trained economists who felt that behavioral economics is paternalistic, it doesn't respect choice, and there's a lot of arbitrage in markets, so that in the end these biases wash away. So we sort of, within the organization like the World Bank, we had to overcome some of these, in-house, it's basically a generational change in economics was going on. We sort of had to work on that. If I could also just add, I think the thing that really made a big difference for us in selling the agenda to the board and to the World Bank leadership was to document carefully the biases of World Bank staff. We did a survey of 2,000 World Bank staff. Then we replicated this with UK civil servants and found that we're biased ourselves. And that made everyone sort of stand up and pay attention. And because it's one thing for people out there to be biased, one thing for you to be biased as an organization. And that was a real selling point to overcome, to make the case.
Kelly, did you experience anything similar? I mean, here you are potentially competing with what I'm going to call the big box consulting firms, and you come in with the team of scientists and they come in with the hotshot consultants. Pushback?
It's interesting for us. There's a couple of things that we have that are embedded within behavioral economics that make the case for us. So sometimes what we're dealing with is organizations that might be very embedded with using big data. They talk a lot about big data or data science methods. And they might talk about, for instance, being embedded in with design thinking practices. And while both of those are necessary and important for organizations, there's some gaps. And bringing the three of those methods together is actually one of the best starting points. Data science is great for analyzing patterns in existing data. It might also mean a culture that is ready or already doing at least simple experiments. From that big data side, we can look at things like predictive analytics. If people did this thing in the past, then it's likely that they're going to do the following thing tomorrow. But behavioral economics is all about the future. It's all about changing the factors. It's all about changing the dynamics. Right. It's all about thinking about imagining possibilities and designing experiments after introducing choice architecture that changes everything. So the big data is no longer relevant. And of course, the data analytics skills are absolutely vital. But without injecting new insights, we're just repeating. And on the design thinking side, while it's wonderful the impact that design thinking has had on organizations understanding the impact of things like design, the final mile, in terms of why people will make a choice. There's beautiful analogies of, I love seeing, for instance, the examples in the wild of, you've got the perpendicular sidewalk and the path that's well worn on the other side, like bringing to life all of the impact of the human experience on products and services. But without experimentation, without theory-driven insights, then we fall short. So for organizations to have a kind of a holistic approach to understanding behavior and behavior change, They need to understand, again, not this system-mindedness and be married and embedded with what they've tried, but be open to bring in the scientific method as well.
That is fantastic. That's exactly the science of using the science that we spoke about earlier. I'm going to come back to each one of you for a quick 30-second response in about a minute. Here's my question. 10 years from now, it's this crystal ball gazing when we are looking back and saying, okay, we put out this prescription for behaviorally informed organizations. What do you think is going to happen 10 years from now? Will we be successful at doing this? So just quick, super 30 seconds. Before that, I just want to acknowledge a question from Charlotte, who writes from Frankfurt, asking about the equivalent of open science within the applied world. I have, and the replication crisis, I have two quick responses. One is, I think in the applied sciences, I personally never even expect things to replicate because there are so many more contextual variables that we need to worry about in the wild that it would be almost foolish to expect things to replicate. And that's exactly the goal of our next book. So a lot more on that there. And obviously, we try to be as open as possible. There is now a move towards publishing a lot of null results as well. But there are organizational frictions. There are companies not wanting to share data. And so it's not as simple as we would like it to be. But the short answer to Charlotte is A, yes, there is a move. And B, that we do need to be sensitive to the fact that because context is always so complex that we shouldn't even expect things to replicate. That's why it's really important to test. Catherine, can I begin with your 30 seconds? 10 years from now, looking back. Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Thumbs up. Well, I think behavior econ or BI will become basically become a DNA of a lot of organizations. Because the way I see it is that that human centricity is a very natural way of managing an organization or of making things work. What we have to overcome are basically all the fictions and all the status quo bias and also some of the assumptions that humans are like econs, right? Once these things are overcome, it would be very natural for us to adopt human centricity. So 10 years.
Right. Varun? One sentence?
I recall Richard Thaler being asked, what do you think of the futures of behavioral economics? And he said, in, 10, 20 years, it's not going to exist. People said, what? And he said, behavioral economics, it'll just be economics. It's going to become broad and everyone will study it. And from where I sit, I think of what happened to gender international development. It was once cutting edge and now it's kind of everywhere. I think the question is whether behavioral economics becomes like gender, sort of diffuse and spread around the organization, or whether it becomes like healthcare, which also at one point was new and now has its own department. That's, I think, to be seen.
All right, Kelly, you get 30 seconds. I know Brianna is on, which means it's time for us to wrap up.
I wouldn't call it a replication crisis. I'd call it a replication renaissance. Scientific thinking is all about things not working in some cases and continuing to experiment and test and find out what is working. It's about the transparency of our methods. It's about learning what's working and what's not working and bringing all of those things forward. That's the scientific process and the scientific method itself. Perfect. So 10 years from now, if we have more scientific thinking in society, overall we'll be in a much better place.
Fantastic. On that optimistic note, Kelly, Catherine, Varun, thank you. And back to you, Brianna.
Thank you, Dilip. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and especially to everyone who contributed questions. This was an incredibly interesting conversation on BI and its challenges and future opportunities. It was really wonderful. So here is a copy of the book. It is available everywhere, including our University of Toronto Press website. So I encourage everyone to get a copy. Thank you again to Kelly and Varun and Catherine and Dilip. This was wonderful. So thank you everyone very much, and enjoy the rest of your evenings or mornings, depending on where you are. So thank you very much.